The courtroom fell silent as my 5-year-old son gripped the edge of the witness stand, his small voice cutting through the tension as he said, "He never hit me. He saved me." In that moment, every lie they built began to crack. It hadn't started there, of course. Nothing this ugly ever does. It started quietly, almost invisibly, in the spaces people assume are safe: family dinners, holiday gatherings, polite smiles stretched just thin enough to hide judgment. By the time I realized what was happening, the ground beneath my feet had already begun to shift. My son, Noah, had always been different in the way that brilliance sometimes is: precise, sensitive, deeply aware of patterns others ignored. He was diagnosed with high-functioning autism at 3, and while the word itself scared people, it never scared me. What scared me was how quickly others decided what that word meant about him. Lila left when Noah was 4 years, 2 months, and 15 days old. He made sure I never forgot that number. She didn't just leave me, she left him, and worse than that, she told him why. "You're broken," she said, like she was explaining a cracked plate she didn't want to keep. I remember the way Noah stood there, not crying, not screaming, just processing, as if he were trying to solve an equation that didn't have a logical answer. I stepped in before she could say anything else, but the damage had already rooted itself somewhere deep inside him, a quiet question that would take years to fully unravel. After she left, her family didn't disappear with her. If anything, they became more present, more invasive, like they believed her absence gave them ownership. Victor and Margaret started with advice that sounded harmless on the surface, suggestions about structure, discipline, how I should be raising Noah properly. But advice turned into criticism, and criticism into surveillance. Derek, Lila's brother, was the worst of them. He carried this casual cruelty, the kind that disguises itself as tough love, and he seemed especially interested in Noah, as if he had something to prove. The first time Noah told me he wished he was normal, it wasn't after a bad day or a meltdown. It was after a fireworks show we'd gone to together. He had covered his ears, overwhelmed by the sound, his body trembling as the sky lit up in violent bursts of color. Derek had leaned down afterward and said, "Normal boys don't cry over noise." That sentence lodged itself into Noah's mind like a splinter. That night, as I tucked him into bed, he asked me quietly, "Dad, am I not normal?" I felt something in me fracture, something protective and furious all at once, and I told him the truth the only way I knew how, that normal didn't matter, that he was extraordinary, that his brain worked in ways most people could never understand. But I could see in his eyes that the world had already started teaching him a different story. It escalated faster than I expected. One week, Derek was showing up unannounced, criticizing how I handled Noah's sensory overloads, insisting I was coddling him. The next, he tricked Noah into getting into his truck with promises of ice cream, only to leave him alone at a playground 3 towns over and call child services, claiming I had abandoned him. That investigation didn't hold, but it planted something dangerous in their minds, a narrative they could twist. Soon after, Victor and Margaret filed for emergency custody, not because of anything real I had done, but because of who Noah was. They used his autism as evidence against me, reframing his sensory meltdowns as abuse, his struggles as proof of my failure. By the time we reached the first court hearing, I understood what we were up against. They had money, lawyers, carefully curated stories. All I had was the truth and a 5-year-old boy who loved me more fiercely than I deserved. I knew the courtroom would overwhelm him, the noise, the unfamiliar faces, the pressure, so I prepared him the only way I could. We practiced. We read transcripts together like bedtime stories. We turned stuffed animals into judges and lawyers, acted out scenarios until he knew what to expect. I taught him how to breathe when things got too loud, how to ground himself when the world started spinning too fast. And every single day, I reminded him that no matter what happened, I was there. When the trial began, their attorney painted me as something monstrous. Neglectful, unstable, even violent. He spoke with this polished confidence, as if repeating a lie enough times could turn it into fact. I could feel the room shifting against me, the weight of judgment pressing in from every direction. For a moment, I was terrified, not for myself, but for Noah. I glanced over, expecting him to be overwhelmed, maybe scared. But instead, he looked angry. Not confused, not anxious, but deeply, quietly furious in a way I had never seen before. When they called him to the stand, my heart nearly stopped. He walked up there with his small blue notebook clutched to his chest, just like we practiced. At first, I thought he would follow the plan, recite what we had rehearsed together, but then he looked at their lawyer and said, "That man is lying." The words came out steady, unwavering, and the room seemed to hold its breath. My dad never hit me. He loves me. When my mom tried to hurt me, he stopped her. Every sentence he spoke chipped away at the illusion they had built, not because he was dramatic, but because he was precise, factual, undeniable. He kept going, describing the little things I did, the way I kept his food separate so textures wouldn't overwhelm him, how I labeled his bookshelves so he could always find what he needed, how I never lied to him. Then, almost as an afterthought, he added, "I know what the law says. It says you're supposed to do what's best for me, and what's best for me is staying with my dad." I didn't realize I was crying until I felt it, the kind of tears that come from somewhere too deep to control. The judge ruled in our favor that day. Full custody, no visitation for her family. It should have felt like the end of something, like we had finally escaped. But as Derek shouted from across the courtroom, red-faced and furious, "You think this is over?" I knew it wasn't. And as Victor passed me, his voice low and certain as he said, "You have no idea what you've started," I felt that fragile sense of victory begin to crack. Because people like them don't lose quietly. And deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. The weeks after the ruling should have felt like relief, like the kind of quiet that comes after a storm finally passes. But instead, it felt like standing in the eye of something that hadn't finished forming. At first, there was nothing. No calls, no visits, no legal threats. And that silence was almost worse because it carried the weight of expectation, like something was watching from just beyond sight, waiting for the right moment to return. I tried to rebuild our routine anyway, because routine was the one thing Noah could rely on when everything else felt uncertain. We kept our mornings structured, breakfast at exactly 7 a.m., the same chair, the same bowl, the same carefully separated portions of food, because consistency wasn't just comfort for him, it was stability, something solid in a world that kept trying to shift beneath his feet. For a little while, it worked. He started sleeping through the night again, his nightmares fading into less frequent whispers. His laughter came back too, quiet at first, then more certain, especially when we spent evenings working on his science projects or reading astronomy books together. Those were the moments I held on to, the ones that reminded me why I had fought so hard in that courtroom. But the peace didn't last, not really. It never does when people like Victor and Derek are involved. It began with small things, subtle enough that I almost convinced myself I was imagining it. A car parked across the street a little too often, its engine idling just long enough to feel intentional. A glimpse of a familiar red truck near Noah's school, gone by the time I looked again. Then came the patterns, repeated sightings, the same vehicles, the same faces appearing in places they had no reason to be. They never approached us directly, never crossed a line that would make it easy to prove harassment, but the message was clear. They were still there, still watching. Noah noticed before I wanted him to. One afternoon, as we left the park, his hand tightened around mine, his voice dropping into that careful, analytical tone he used when something didn't make sense. "That truck has been here 3 times this week," he said, not looking at me but tracking it with his peripheral vision. I followed his gaze and saw it, parked just far enough away to seem coincidental, but not enough to feel random. My chest tightened, but I kept my voice steady, because if I let my fear show, it would multiply inside him. "Probably just someone who likes this park," I said, knowing even as I spoke that he wouldn't accept such an incomplete explanation. He didn't argue, but I could see the calculation happening behind his eyes, the quiet gathering of data. The harassment grew more deliberate after that, like they had realized subtlety alone wasn't enough. Derek began orchestrating encounters, appearing at the grocery store, at the edges of the playground, always just out of reach, always watching. Each time Noah reacted, each flinch, each moment of sensory overload, they captured it, twisting it into something else, something they could use. I didn't know the full extent of what they were doing at the time, but I could feel it building, like pressure behind a sealed door. Then Lila came back. Not all at once, not with the force her family carried, but tentatively, as if she were stepping into a place she didn't fully belong anymore. At first, it was messages, short, cautious, testing the distance between us. Then it became something more formal, something colder. A new custody petition, filed with the backing of her family, supported by expensive lawyers and carefully crafted arguments that painted her as a reformed mother and me as the source of Noah's distress. They framed his anxiety as my failure, his sensitivity as my neglect, twisting every piece of his identity into evidence against me. By the time I realized how coordinated it all was, it was already in motion. Incidents at school began to surface, misunderstandings exaggerated, sensory meltdowns documented out of context, witnesses gathered who had only seen fragments of the truth. They were building a case again, piece by piece, using Noah's struggles as ammunition. And the worst part was that some of it looked convincing on paper. If you didn't know him, if you didn't understand how his mind worked, it would be easy to believe their version of reality. I turned to Dr. Chen, desperate to stay ahead of whatever they were planning. She listened the way she always did, calm, measured, absorbing every detail before offering guidance that felt both practical and deeply human. "You can't control what they do," she told me during one session, her voice steady but firm. "But you can control how you prepare, and you can help Noah feel safe, even when things aren't." We doubled down on strategies, reinforcing the tools Noah already had: breathing techniques, grounding exercises, ways to process overwhelming situations without shutting down. But even as we prepared, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were missing something, that there was a part of their plan we hadn't seen yet. The night before the new hearing, I barely slept. My mind kept circling the same questions, the same fears that refused to settle. What if this time they succeeded? What if the judge believed them? What if Noah froze under pressure, overwhelmed by the noise, the attention, the weight of everything being decided around him? By the time morning came, I felt like I had already lived through the worst possible outcomes, each one more suffocating than the last. When I walked into Noah's room at exactly 6 a.m., I found him already awake, sitting cross-legged on his bed, his blue notebook open in front of him. The soft light from his nightlamp illuminated his focused expression as he flipped through pages filled with neat, organized notes, each section marked with red stars. He didn't look up right away, just said, "I organized my thoughts by importance," in that same matter-of-fact tone that somehow made everything feel both heavier and more manageable at the same time. I sat beside him, careful not to disturb the precise arrangement of his blanket, and told him he was doing great, even though my chest ached at the sight of how prepared he had become for something no child should ever have to face. As we left the house, heading toward the courthouse once again, I realized something that settled deep in my bones. This wasn't just another hearing. It was a continuation of a war they had no intention of ending. And this time, they had come back smarter, more calculated, more dangerous. But what I didn't know yet, what I couldn't have known, was that Noah had been preparing in ways even I hadn't seen. The courthouse felt colder that morning, as if the walls themselves remembered what had happened the last time we stood there and were bracing for something worse. The air carried that sterile mix of polished wood and quiet tension, and every step we took echoed just a little too loudly, like the building was announcing our arrival whether we wanted it to or not. Patrick met us in the hallway, his expression tight, his usual confidence edged with something heavier as he leaned in and said quietly, "They came prepared this time," and I could smell the coffee on his breath, sharp and bitter, matching the knot already forming in my chest. Inside, Lila sat at the plaintiff's table, composed in a way that almost looked rehearsed, her posture straight, her expression carefully softened into something maternal. Beside her, Victor and Margaret sat like silent pillars of control, while Derek leaned back in his chair with that same smug half-smile, like he already believed the outcome was his. I felt Noah's hand brush against mine, not gripping, just grounding himself, and I gave a small squeeze in return, a silent reminder that we were still together in this, no matter what they threw at us. When the judge called the court to order, the sharp crack of the gavel made Noah flinch just slightly, his fingers tightening around his notebook, but he steadied himself quickly, his breathing evening out the way we had practiced. Lila's attorney moved first, his voice smooth and calculated, weaving a story that almost sounded reasonable if you didn't know the truth behind it. He spoke about her growth, her regret, the parenting classes she had taken, painting her as someone who had transformed into the mother Noah deserved. Then he shifted, subtly at first, but with increasing precision, turning his focus onto me, reframing Noah's anxiety, his sensitivity, his struggles as evidence of emotional harm caused by my parenting. Each word felt like a deliberate strike, not loud, not aggressive, but carefully placed to build a narrative that made me look like the problem. Patrick countered with everything we had: Dr. Chen's reports, documentation of Noah's progress, records that showed how consistent structure and understanding had helped him thrive. He laid out the timeline of harassment, the repeated sightings, the patterns we had tracked, presenting them not as isolated incidents but as a coordinated effort to destabilize Noah's environment. I watched the judge as he spoke, her pen moving steadily across her notes, her expression unreadable, and I tried to find something in her posture that hinted at which way she was leaning. But there was nothing to grasp onto, just the steady weight of the moment pressing forward. Then she turned to Noah. "Would you like to speak today?" she asked, her tone gentler than before, and for a second, everything seemed to narrow down to that single question. Noah looked up, his eyes scanning the room, taking in every face, every movement, before he nodded and stood. He walked to the witness stand with that same quiet precision he carried everywhere, his blue notebook held firmly against his chest, and when he sat down, he opened it to a page marked with bright red stars, smoothing the paper with his palm as if preparing a presentation rather than stepping into a legal battle. "I brought notes so I don't forget important things," he said, his voice small but clear, and the simplicity of it made something tighten in my chest. He started with facts, the way his mind always did, grounding everything in specifics that couldn't be easily twisted. "My mom left when I was 4 years, 2 months, and 15 days old," he said, and I saw Lila flinch, her composure cracking just slightly as his words settled into the room. "She said I was broken." The silence that followed felt heavier than anything that had been said before, because there was no argument against it, no way to soften what had already happened. He continued, methodical and steady, flipping pages as he went, detailing the absence, the missed birthdays, the lack of calls, but also something else. How I had never spoken badly about her, how I had explained her absence in a way that didn't make him feel like it was his fault. Each statement built on the last, not emotional in the way most people expected, but precise in a way that made it impossible to ignore. Then he shifted, his voice tightening just slightly as he described the recent months, the cars, the watching, the sudden appearances that made his brain feel like it was full of bees, as he put it, his words painting a picture of anxiety that wasn't abstract, but deeply real. He described hiding under his desk at school, the way his thoughts scattered when he felt watched, the way his body reacted before he could stop it, and for the first time, I saw something flicker across the judge's face, a recognition of what was really happening beneath the surface. When he finished that page, he paused, taking a slow breath the way we had practiced, and then he turned to another section of his notebook, one I hadn't seen before. My stomach tightened as he looked up, his gaze shifting briefly toward Derek before returning to the judge. "Last fact," he said, and there was something different in his tone now, something sharper, more certain. "Yesterday, Uncle Derek came to our house." The words hit me like a sudden drop, my mind scrambling to catch up, to understand what he was saying, because I hadn't known about this. Not a single part of it. I felt a cold wave spread through my chest as Noah continued, explaining how he had been homesick, how he had heard Derek at the back door, how he had listened, not out of curiosity, but because something in him had recognized the importance of what was being said. "He thought I wasn't there," Noah said, his fingers tightening slightly on the edge of the stand, but I heard him talking on his phone. He said, "Once we get the kid, we'll make sure he never sees his father again." The courtroom erupted before he could even finish, chairs scraping, voices rising, Derek shooting to his feet, his face flushed with anger as he shouted that it was a lie. But Noah didn't flinch this time. He just reached into his pocket, pulled out a small recorder, and said with quiet certainty, "I recorded it. Dad says evidence matters." And in that moment, everything shifted. The sound didn't come back all at once. It returned in fragments, murmurs, the scrape of chairs, the sharp echo of the judge's gavel cutting through the chaos as she ordered silence. I sat there frozen, my heart hammering so hard it felt like it might break through my ribs, watching as Noah held out the recorder with a steadiness that didn't match the storm he had just unleashed. Patrick moved quickly, taking it from him with a look that was part disbelief, part urgency, then passing it forward as instructed. The judge listened privately, her expression tightening with each passing second, and when she finally removed the headphones, there was something unmistakable in her face, not just concern, but resolve. "This court will take a 30-minute recess," she said, her voice firm enough to leave no room for argument, and as the room began to shift again, people rising, whispering, reacting, I could only focus on Noah as he stepped down from the stand. His shoulders had dropped, the tension finally catching up to him, and when he reached me, I pulled him into a careful side hug, mindful of how easily too much pressure could overwhelm him. "You did incredible," I whispered, my voice thick, my mind still trying to process what he had done, not just the recording, but the fact that he had carried it alone, quietly building something that might have just saved us. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked softly, not accusing, just trying to understand, and he looked at me with that same calm logic that had always defined him. "I was collecting data," he said, as if that explained everything, and in a way, it did. "Dr. Chen says sometimes you have to observe before you act." I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding, a strange mix of pride and heartbreak settling into my chest because no child should have to think that way, and yet here he was, doing exactly what was needed when I hadn't even known we were one step away from losing everything. When the court reconvened, the atmosphere had changed entirely. The quiet was heavier now, not uncertain, but anticipatory, as if everyone in that room understood that something decisive was about to happen. The judge wasted no time, her voice carrying a weight that seemed to press against the walls themselves as she issued an immediate restraining order against Derek, extending it far enough that he couldn't come within 500 feet of either of us. She turned to Lila then, her gaze sharp, cutting through whatever composure remained. "This court is deeply troubled by what we have just heard," she said, and for the first time, Lila looked truly shaken, her carefully constructed image cracking under the pressure of something she couldn't control. "I didn't know," Lila said, her voice unsteady, and for a moment, I almost believed her, because there was a rawness there that didn't feel rehearsed. But the judge didn't allow the moment to linger. "You may address that during your testimony," she replied, her tone measured but firm. "This court will reconvene tomorrow for final arguments and a ruling. In the meantime, I am ordering a full investigation into the allegations presented here today." Outside, the sunlight felt almost disorienting, too bright after the weight of the courtroom, casting long shadows across the steps as we made our way toward the parking lot. For the first time in weeks, I felt something shift inside me, not relief, not yet, but something close to it, like the possibility of breathing without that constant pressure on my chest. But it didn't last long. "Wait," Lila's voice called out behind us, and I turned instinctively, positioning myself slightly in front of Noah as she approached, her steps quick, uneven, as if she were trying to catch up not just physically but emotionally. Patrick moved to intercept her, but she shook her head, her words coming out in a rush. "The restraining order doesn't apply to me. Please, I just need a minute." I hesitated, then nodded, giving her that small window, though every instinct in me remained on edge. Up close, she looked different. Not just older, but worn in a way that no amount of careful presentation could hide. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her composure frayed, and when she spoke, the words came without the polish they had carried in court. "I didn't know what they were planning," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "They told me they wanted to help me reconnect with him, that you were keeping him from me." I let out a slow breath, keeping my voice steady. "You left," I reminded her. "You called him broken and walked away. You never tried to come back." She looked down at that, her silence stretching just long enough to confirm what we both already knew. "I was scared," she admitted finally. "And they used that. They made it sound like you turned him against me, like I didn't have a chance unless I fought for custody." I studied her face, searching for the familiar patterns of manipulation, the subtle cues that had once been so easy to miss, but all I saw was something raw and uncertain. Why now? I asked. Because timing mattered, and nothing about her family had ever been accidental. Because I heard the recording, she said, her voice quieter now, almost fragile. What Derek said, they were never going to let me be his mother again. They were using me. She swallowed hard, then looked past me, her gaze settling on Noah, who had edged closer but remained half-hidden behind my side. I want to withdraw my petition, she continued, her words steadying as she spoke them. And I want to say I'm sorry, to both of you. Noah stepped forward slightly then, his eyes narrowing in that thoughtful, analytical way he had when he was processing something important. Are you still scared of me? He asked, his voice direct, unfiltered, and the question seemed to catch her off guard in a way nothing else had. I was never scared of you, she said after a moment, her voice softening. I was scared of failing you. Noah considered that, the silence stretching as he weighed her answer, then gave a small, single nod. Okay, he said simply. Apology accepted. He looked up at me then, his tone shifting back to something more familiar. Can we go home now? I almost smiled, the simplicity of it cutting through everything else. Yeah, I said, resting a hand on his shoulder. We can go home. But as we turned to leave, Lila's voice followed us one last time, quieter now, but no less certain. They won't stop, she said. My parents, Derek, they'll find another way. I paused just long enough to glance back at her, the weight of her words settling into something that felt less like a warning and more like a certainty I already carried. I know, I said. That's why we're leaving. And for the first time, I meant it. That night, the house felt different, not because anything had changed physically, but because every object now carried the quiet understanding that it might soon be left behind. I moved through each room slowly, noticing details I had long stopped seeing, the faint scratch on the kitchen table, the way the hallway light flickered for half a second before stabilizing, the soft indentation on the couch where Noah always sat with his books. It wasn't just a house anymore, it was a collection of moments, and I knew we were about to walk away from all of them. When I tucked Noah into bed, he was quieter than usual, his mind clearly working through something as his fingers traced the edge of his blanket in small, repetitive motions. Where are we going to move to? He asked, his voice steady but carrying that underlying need for certainty that I knew I couldn't fully give him yet. I sat down beside him, the mattress dipping slightly under my weight, and chose my words carefully. Somewhere safe, I said, somewhere quiet, with good schools and a place where you can keep doing all the things you love. He frowned slightly, processing that, then asked the questions that mattered most to him. Will they have a teacher like Miss Quinn? And what about Dr. Chen? And my library card. I only have 11 stamps left. Each question landed heavier than the last, because they weren't just about logistics. They were about stability, about the pieces of his world that made sense. We'll find new people, I said gently, and new places. It might take time, but we'll figure it out together. He considered that, then nodded slowly, as if accepting a hypothesis he couldn't fully test yet. Can I bring my bookshelf labels? He asked after a moment, and I smiled despite everything. Of course. He thought a little longer, then added, and my solar system model? Definitely. That seemed to settle him, at least enough to move forward. He reached under his pillow, pulled out his blue notebook, and wrote something down, the soft scratching of pencil against paper filling the room. What did you write? I asked. A hypothesis, he replied without looking up. I think we'll be okay if we stay together. I leaned down, pressing a kiss to his forehead, and whispered, That's not a hypothesis, that's a fact. The next morning, the courtroom felt final in a way it hadn't before, as if everyone present understood that this was the moment everything would be decided. Lila sat alone this time, her parents and Derek nowhere in sight, their absence more telling than their presence had ever been. When the judge called the session to order, Lila stood almost immediately, her hands trembling slightly as she addressed the court. I would like to withdraw my petition for custody, she said, her voice steadier than her posture suggested. I believe my son is where he needs to be. There was a pause, a subtle shift in the room as the weight of her words settled, and the judge studied her carefully before nodding. What followed was more than I had dared to hope for. The restraining order was expanded, not just against Derek, but against her entire family, extending to anyone acting on their behalf. An investigation was formally launched into the harassment and the recorded threat, and most importantly, I was granted the right to relocate with Noah without disclosing our new address. This court finds a clear and ongoing threat to the child's well-being, the judge stated, her voice carrying a finality that felt like a door closing on everything we had endured. The father has demonstrated consistent, protective, and appropriate care. He is authorized to take whatever steps are necessary to ensure the child's safety. As we walked out of that courthouse for the last time, the weight that lifted from my chest was almost overwhelming. It wasn't just relief, it was vindication, exhaustion, and something else too, something quieter. A kind of mourning for the life we were leaving behind. In the parking lot, Patrick shook my hand, his grip firm, his expression carrying a rare hint of satisfaction. "You won," he said simply, and I nodded, though it didn't feel like a victory so much as survival. When he asked where we were going, I shook my head. "Better if you don't know," I told him, and he understood immediately, offering a small nod before stepping back. We passed Lila on the way to the car. She stood alone, her posture smaller somehow, stripped of the support she had leaned on for so long. Our eyes met briefly, and she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. I returned it, not out of forgiveness, not entirely, but out of acknowledgement. There was nothing left to say. The days that followed were a blur of movement and preparation. We packed only what we needed, prioritizing essentials over sentiment, though it was impossible not to feel the weight of what we left behind. Noah approached it with his usual precision, organizing his belongings into categories, labeling boxes with careful handwriting, ensuring that nothing important was misplaced. The sound of tape-sealing boxes became a constant backdrop, marking the slow dismantling of the life we had built. Before we left, we made 2 final stops. The first was the library. Miss Eden greeted us with a warmth that immediately faltered when she realized why we were there. Noah handed her his card, explaining in his matter-of-fact tone that he wouldn't be able to finish collecting his stamps because we were moving for safety reasons. She disappeared briefly and returned with a brand-new astronomy encyclopedia, placing it in his hands with a soft smile. "Consider this your reward," she said. "Some things matter more than stamps." Noah studied the book, then nodded solemnly. "Libraries are essential repositories of human knowledge," he replied, and she laughed through tears, telling him to promise he'd find another one wherever we went. Our second stop was Dr. Chen's office. She met us on her day off, the familiar calm of her space offering one last moment of grounding before everything changed. She reviewed coping strategies with Noah, reminding him that it was okay to feel scared, angry, or uncertain, that change was difficult for everyone. He listened carefully, then said, "I feel all of those things, but also curious," and she smiled, looking at me with quiet reassurance. "He's going to be okay," she said. "You both are." The morning we left, the world felt still, as if it hadn't quite caught up to the fact that we were about to disappear from it. As I did one final walk through the house, I found a drawing taped to Noah's wall, a simple sketch of our home, 2 stick figures standing outside, and beneath it, in his careful handwriting, the words, "Our first home, where Dad taught me I'm not broken." I folded it carefully and placed it in my wallet, knowing it was something I would carry no matter where we went. When I stepped outside, Noah was already in the car, his notebook open to a fresh page titled, "Our Adventure." He looked at me as I got in, his expression calm but expectant. "Ready?" I asked, and he nodded. "Ready." As we pulled away, I checked the rearview mirror out of instinct, half expecting to see a familiar car, a shadow of the life we were leaving behind. But there was nothing there, just an empty street, quiet and still. For the first time in a long while, we were ahead of them. But I still had one more stop to make, something Noah didn't know about yet, something that would ensure that even if they tried to find us again, they wouldn't succeed. Because this time, I wasn't just leaving. I was making sure we could never be found. The building didn't look like anything special, just a low, gray structure tucked between a closed insurance office and an empty lot, the kind of place you could pass 100 times without ever remembering it existed. I parked across the street, the engine idling softly as Noah flipped through his new astronomy book, completely absorbed, and I told him I needed to grab some documents before we left town. He nodded without looking up, already halfway through a page about distant galaxies, and for a moment, I just watched him, memorizing the calm on his face, because everything I was about to do was for that exact expression. Inside, the air smelled faintly of paper and coffee, and the woman behind the desk looked up with sharp, assessing eyes that missed nothing. Diane Mercer didn't waste time with pleasantries. She handed me a sealed envelope and said, "Everything's in there," her voice steady, practiced. "New identification, updated records, financial accounts, school transfers. You're starting clean." I held the envelope a little tighter than I meant to, the weight of it far greater than the thin stack of documents it contained. And monitoring. I asked, because disappearing wasn't enough. I needed to know if they ever started looking in the right direction again. She nodded. "Already in place. If anyone starts digging too close to your old life, we'll see it. You'll have time to move again if you need to." I let out a slow breath, one that felt like it had been building for months, and thanked her before stepping back out into the morning light. When I got back into the car, Noah barely glanced up. "Did you get the documents?" he asked, turning a page with quiet focus. "Yeah," I said, tucking the envelope into my jacket. "All set." He nodded, satisfied, then looked out the window as we pulled away, the town slipping past in familiar fragments, streets we had walked 100 times, places that held memories I didn't have the luxury of revisiting. After a while, he said quietly, "We lived here for 2,347 days, and I glanced at him, struck again by the way his mind held on to details that most people let fade. "That's a lot of days," I replied. He nodded. "But we'll have more days somewhere else." Hours passed on the road, the hum of the engine blending with the soft scratch of his pencil as he documented everything: license plates, cloud patterns, distances between stops, turning the journey into something measurable, something he could understand. Somewhere around midday, he asked, "Are we going to change our names?" And I almost laughed at how directly he arrived at the question I had been avoiding. "Just our last name," I admitted. "It'll make it harder for certain people to find us." He considered that, then said, "Like Victor and Derek," and I nodded. "Exactly." He thought for a moment longer, then added, "I've been thinking about names. Maybe something like Chen or Quinn, or something related to space." I smiled despite myself. "We already picked one," I said. "Walker." He repeated it quietly, testing it, then gave a small nod. "It sounds like movement," he said. "That's good for hiding." I didn't correct him. We reached the city late that night, the unfamiliar skyline rising in soft lights that felt both distant and full of possibility. The apartment I had rented was small, older, with creaking floors and radiators that clanked unpredictably, but it was clean, secure, and most importantly, anonymous. Noah explored it with careful attention, running his fingers along the built-in shelves in his new room before declaring, "This is acceptable," though he added that the shelves would need labels. "We'll fix that tomorrow," I promised, exhaustion finally catching up to me. The first few nights were the hardest. Every unfamiliar sound felt like a threat. The hum of appliances, footsteps in the hallway, distant sirens echoing through streets we didn't yet know. I slept lightly, waking at the smallest noise, my mind always reaching for the worst-case scenario. But the messages I expected never came. No calls, no sightings, no signs that anyone had followed us. Days turned into weeks, and slowly, cautiously, we began to build something new. I found remote work that allowed me to stay close to Noah, to maintain the structure he needed while giving us the flexibility to adjust. We found a new therapist, Dr. Ramirez, who understood both autism and trauma, who met Noah exactly where he was without trying to change who he was. The school nearby had teachers trained to support students like him, and while the transition wasn't easy, there were moments of overwhelm, days when everything felt too loud, too unpredictable. He adapted in the way he always did, by observing, analyzing, and finding patterns. He mapped the neighborhood with almost scientific precision, identifying the quietest routes, the least crowded times, the safest places to go when he needed space. He found the local library within days, introducing himself with that same formal clarity that sometimes caught people off guard but quickly won them over. And then, unexpectedly, he made a friend. Zoe was quiet in a way that matched him, curious about the same things, patient with his need for precision. She says I talk like a professor, he told me one evening, not quite hiding the hint of pride in his voice. She says it's cool. I smiled and said, she's right. Months passed, and while the fear never fully disappeared, it softened, fading into something that no longer controlled every decision. Diane sent occasional updates, small attempts by Victor's family to track us, a private investigator who lost the trail at the state line, but nothing that came close to reaching us. We had become something they couldn't easily trace, a life built quietly, carefully, beyond their reach. By the time we found a permanent home, a modest house with a fenced yard and a rooftop deck perfect for Noah's telescope, it almost felt unreal. Standing there on that roof the first night, watching him adjust the lens as he tracked Jupiter across the sky, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to believe before. We hadn't just escaped. We had started over. And for the first time, it felt like that might actually be enough. Time didn't erase everything, but it changed the weight of it. The fear that once lived in every corner of my mind became something more distant, like a storm you remember rather than one you're still standing inside. A year passed, then another, and slowly, life stopped feeling like something we were rebuilding and started feeling like something we were actually living. Noah grew into himself in ways that were both subtle and remarkable, his confidence stretching outward with each new routine he mastered, each new environment he mapped and understood. He still had difficult days. The unexpected fire alarm at school that sent him into a spiral, the sudden rearrangement of shelves at the grocery store that left him disoriented, but those moments no longer defined him. They were just part of a larger pattern, one he was learning to navigate on his own terms. Our house became exactly what he had once drawn in that notebook, a quiet place where he could exist without being watched, without being judged, where his thoughts could unfold without interruption. The rooftop deck turned into his favorite space, a place where the world felt wide and infinite instead of confined and unpredictable. On clear nights, we would sit side by side, his telescope angled toward the sky as he tracked planets and constellations with the same careful precision he applied to everything else. Sometimes he would explain what he was seeing, slipping into that calm, almost academic tone that made it easy to forget he was still just a child. Other times, we would sit in silence, letting the vastness above us settle something unspoken between us. 2 years after we left, a package arrived through Patrick's office, forwarded with the same discretion that had protected us all this time. I knew who it was from before I even opened it. The handwriting on the envelope hadn't changed. Inside was a letter from Lila, longer than anything she had ever written before, filled with apologies that felt less like an attempt to fix the past and more like an acknowledgement that it couldn't be fixed. She wrote about therapy, about confronting her parents, about finally understanding the damage she had caused. There were no demands, no requests to see Noah, just a quiet hope that we were safe and that someday, maybe, he might want to hear from her again. Along with the letter was a small box. Inside, resting on a thin layer of protective foam, was a fragment of meteorite, dark and textured, accompanied by a certificate of authenticity. I could almost hear her voice in the gesture, remembering the one thing Noah had always loved without complication. For a long time, I sat there holding it, weighing not just the object but what it represented, before deciding that this wasn't something I had the right to keep from him. That evening, I handed him both the letter and the box. He read slowly, carefully, his expression giving little away as he moved through each line. When he finished, he opened the box and turned the meteorite over in his hands, examining it with quiet focus. "It's a chondrite," he said after a moment. "Probably from the asteroid belt, very old." I asked him what he wanted to do, and he thought for a while before placing it gently among his collection. "I want to keep it," he said. "But I don't want to write back, not yet." I nodded, because that choice belonged entirely to him. "Whenever you're ready," I told him. "Or even if you're not." Or even if you're not. By the 3rd year, the updates from Patrick became less frequent, then stopped altogether. The final one came in the form of a brief message. Victor had passed away, Margaret had moved away, and Derek was still in prison, caught in a situation entirely unrelated to us but one that ensured he wouldn't be a threat again anytime soon. Lila, he said, was living quietly, working as a teacher's aide, keeping her distance. When I read it, I felt something shift, not relief exactly, but closure. The kind that doesn't announce itself loudly but settles in slowly, like the last piece of something falling into place. That night, I found Noah on the roof again, his telescope aimed at a sky so clear it almost didn't feel real. "Dad," he said without looking away, "I've been trying to remember our old house." I sat beside him, the familiar creak of the deck grounding me in the present. "What about it?" I asked. He hesitated, then said, "I can't picture it clearly anymore. The details are fuzzy." There was something in his voice, not fear exactly, but uncertainty, like he wasn't sure if forgetting was something he was supposed to allow. I reached into my wallet and pulled out the drawing he had made years ago, the one I had carried with me through every step of our escape. The paper was worn now, creased from being folded and unfolded so many times, but the image was still clear: the house, the two figures, the words beneath it. "Some things are worth remembering," I said, handing it to him. His eyes widened slightly as he traced the lines with his finger, taking in something both familiar and distant at the same time. "You kept it," he said quietly. "Of course," I replied. "Always." 5 years after we left, we took a trip to a dark sky preserve, a place where the stars felt impossibly close, where the absence of artificial light made the universe feel larger than anything we had ever known. Noah, now older, more confident in ways that still surprised me, set up his telescope with practiced ease, his notebook filled with observations that had grown more complex over time. As we sat by the fire that night, the glow of it reflecting in his eyes, he asked me a question I hadn't expected. "Do you ever miss our old life?" I thought about it for a moment, about the pieces of it that had once felt like everything. "I miss some parts," I admitted, "but I don't miss the fear." He nodded, his gaze shifting upward to the sky. "I used to be scared all the time," he said. "I didn't realize it until I wasn't anymore." I asked him how he felt now, and he answered without hesitation. "Safe," he said. Then, after a pause, he added, "and not broken." I put my arm around his shoulders, and this time, he didn't pull away. We sat there in the quiet, the fire crackling softly beside us, the stars stretching endlessly above, and I realized that everything we had gone through, all the fear, the running, the rebuilding, had led us to this exact moment. A place where he could say those words and mean them. Later that night, as I tucked him in, a ritual he still allowed despite insisting he didn't need it anymore, he looked at me and said, "Thank you for not giving up." My throat tightened, but I smiled, brushing his hair back gently. "I never will," I told him. "Not on you, not on us." If this story meant something to you, if it reminded you that love is sometimes about fighting battles no one else sees, take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. And if you've ever had to stand up for someone who couldn't stand alone, I'd love to hear your story in the comments.